He received useless powers yet surprised everyone by becoming the strongest. If you dig my recaps, don't forget to subscribe and smash that notification bell. A sarcastic and lonely young man named Haruka is thrown into another world against his will. Discovered by a group of goblins roasting a pig, the boy is forced to run for his life as the monsters chase after him. At one point, Haruka makes a large leap forward, hoping his plan works. Sure enough, when the goblins reach the spot Haruka had cleverly avoided, they fall into a trap he had dug earlier, tumbling into a hole. At that moment, Haruka is left trying to deal with this new universe he's been dragged into all on his own. Flashing back to the day he was teleported, Haruka was spending his break time as usual. Reading his mail was alone. In other words, not only was he a loner in his original life, but he had to be one in another world too. Haruka had nothing in common with the people in his class. Almost everyone belonged to a group: the delinquents, the popular girls, the otakus, and the class representatives. And the rest? Well, they were just the rest. Yes, there were people like him who didn't fit into any group at all. That's when everything happened. The golden magic circle engulfed the entire classroom, ready to whisk everyone away to that crazy new universe. While everyone else had already gone into a panic, lazy Haruka took a while to even lift his head and notice the magical phenomenon happening around him. But once he did, instead of reacting like his classmates, he felt excited for a second, only to realize another world would probably be a drag after all. So he decided to run away. Or at least he tried, but no matter what he did, he couldn't force open the classroom door, which for some reason was locked. As everyone was being pulled into the teleportation, Haruka still held out hope that he could escape through the ceiling. He finally managed to open the ventilation duct and hoped to slip away, but it seems all his efforts were in vain, as the magic circle spread and eventually caught up with him. Soon enough, he found himself in a classic, all-white limbo-like place, the kind that serves as a gateway to another world. The kind where you probably find a fat king and his hot princess, the kind no mirror would ever stand a chance with in real life. Speaking of which, there was an old man in that place, seemingly looking for Haruka. He didn't speak with sounds. Rather, his words appeared in text bubbles like in a video game. Apparently, he was some sort of god in this world, and Haruka's entire class had already been transported to the new world, except for him. So the boy had to hurry up and decide his stats before he could head down. With that, a large status screen appeared in the limbo. Normally, each person would get 50 points to spend on skills and magic, but since this was the old man's first time dealing with 43 people at once, the overpowered abilities had already been taken, leaving only the worst ones. In other words, even though Haruka had hoped to be a mage or a paladin, he had to settle for items like contact lenses or villager as set. As for weapons, among two-handed swords and deadly bows, he ended up with a staff that was basically just a stick. When it came to magic, his choices were well-being and walking. Frustrated, Haruka complained to the old man, who finally gave in and handed him all the remaining skills before sending the kid on his way. And so, Haruka was finally thrown into an isekai in the middle of a forest with the worst abilities and absolutely no clue how to survive in a place like this. The first thing he saw was his villager a set, but to his surprise, the small bag could hold infinite items, and inside there were things like contact lenses, a cloak, a ring of the dead soul, and jewel of knowledge. Haruka still thought all these items seemed pretty useless, but after putting on the cloak, he felt a little more connected to this world. He then tried to check his stats, but quickly remembered that in order to do that, he needed to roll 2 dice, which would determine how many points he had to distribute. Far from the 50 he thought he would get. However, for some reason, the dice rolled an M, something he didn't even know the meaning of. Maybe it stood for masculinity, but it wasn't the time to speculate. He needed to assign his points. He didn't care about balancing his build, so he dumped everything into the luck attribute. As the stats were calculated, he realized his luck was incredibly high, leading him to deduce that the M on the dice meant maximum. On the other hand, all his other attributes remained terrible. At least he got an extra skill, subjugate, which allowed him to make others follow him. But since he was the last one thrown into this world, one of his character conditions was to survive on his own and not be able to form groups. That meant his dream of assembling a party full of girls in this isekai was shattered too. Nevertheless, Haruka decided he needed to find a safe place to stay. But to navigate through the unfamiliar forest, he was definitely going to need the contact lenses from his infinite bag. When he put them on, he had no idea they had the ability of appraisal, allowing him to see the name, category, and usefulness of everything in this world. Surely this skill opened Haruka's eyes to this new reality, making him feel much more aware of what he was doing. With that, he gathered edible mushrooms that increased the user's abilities and stashed them in his infinite bag. At that moment, he apologized for ever dismissing the villager a set, especially after discovering that the bag could also serve as a water bottle. After some more time adventuring, Haruka stumbles upon a cave and decides to explore it, but not without first asking for forgiveness from the monster that may live in this disguised dungeon, even though he prayed it was just an empty cave where he could settle. Taking a glance at his bag, the adventurer had a magical tent and a lantern, so he was halfway to setting up camp there once he ensured the place was vacant. Next, he gathered some branches and leaves to start a fire, using his temperature ability to heat it. As he did this, the ability evolved into fire magic. In addition, he gained clairvoyance, perception, and enemy detection. Despite the pleasant surprise, the sleep that came over him might have caused Haruka to fall asleep in the middle of this hostile land, with only a stick to defend himself. However, the exhaustion was so overwhelming that he had to take the risk, and that's how he survived his first day in this unknown world. The next morning, he woke up safe and sound because the tent and the lantern had abilities that acted as repellents for both insects and monsters, thanks to the recluse title he earned for being the last to arrive in the ice sky. Putting that aside, Haruka felt his stomach growl, so he lit a new fire and tossed the mushrooms and meat he had in his bag over it. With a bit of seasoning to boost the flavor, breakfast was soon ready. To top it off, he hadn't expected to have cooking utensils in his bag, so he imagined this villager A, who had originally owned the equipment, must have been a true survivor of the wilderness. Once he had satisfied his hunger, the adventurer had to decide where to go next, knowing that at least he had a place to stay. The next step was to find spots where he could gather food, as well as improve the security of his shelter. The only issue was the monsters he might encounter along the way. Speaking of which, for his perception ability, he detected 2 goblins, marking his first challenge in this environment. Haruka assessed them to be level 8, which frustrated him even more as he thought these types of monsters would be easy XP for a noob. Nonetheless, he felt the need to learn how to fight as soon as possible, and this might be his chance. So with only a stick in hand, he used his sealing ability, which infused the weapon with magic. He figured that if he couldn't have overpower magic, he would become overpower himself. With that, Haruka charged at the first goblin, striking it on the head with a stick, and as the poor creature spun around like a bug, he finished it off. The second goblin rushed at the human, but Haruka easily dodged the simple, predictable attacks. Finally, he used a bit of his mana to channel energy through the stick and blasted the goblin, finishing the job. After the victory, the boy took a break by the river in the late afternoon. Surviving his first battle filled him with pride. Returning home, Haruka ate his mushrooms and checked out the wooden club he had taken from one of the goblins. However, he found the weapon small, heavy, and useless. Apparently, his stick was enough for now. At least he had leveled up to 2, which was progress. His stats had practically doubled, and he had also leveled up his weapon proficiency skill after pummeling the goblin. Not to mention his sensibility technique, which would prevent him from being caught off guard by goblins who might torment him like a damsel in distress. Additionally, he had gained magic coating after imbuing the staff with magic. Lastly, his calisthenics leveled up because he always stretched when he woke up. At least that's what he did this morning. The next day, Haruka couldn't bear to eat mushrooms anymore and thought about finding new food, but he imagined the class reps wouldn't approve of him wasting food, so he forced himself to swallow it all. Moving past that, he felt much stronger with his level 1 magic coating, as it allowed the user to enhance their physical abilities and magical defense. Surely, every living soul in this world would line up at the market to snag a skill like that. On top of that, his appraisal also leveled up, which made him see question marks at the end of each equipment's name, something that, in his opinion, seemed much worse than before. However, not wanting to stress about it, Haruka set out to finally rid his diet of mushrooms, desperately searching for a decent piece of meat in this godforsaken world. Once he calmed down, he had the idea to use his magic coating, giving him the ability to run and jump with much more force. Not to mention that his attacks had become noticeably faster. With his power, the boy went after more goblins and took out 2. Feeling confident, he thought he could handle 3 at once, but as soon as he came across a trio of monsters, Haruka retreated and headed back home to train a bit more before diving into such a mess. In the following days, he hunted pairs of goblins in the morning and practiced his magic at night. By the 5th day, the adventurer could defeat a goblin in a single blow, and he had even decorated his base with magic, setting up a gate and everything for protection. One day, he finally found a rabbit in the forest and worked hard to catch the little thing so he could eat some meat after such a long time. With the animal in hand, the starving boy could already hear the sound of the pot sizzling, but his perception shifted his focus in another direction. This time, there weren't any monsters around, but rather the delinquents from Haruka's classroom. And it wasn't just them. Using clairvoyance, Haruka discovered that the class princesses, the muscleheads, the otakus, and the class reps were also nearby. Thinking about that last group, Haruka reflected that it might be better to travel as a team. He had known one of the class reps since their first day of school, so perhaps he should just approach them and try a friendly conversation, but he quickly dismissed the idea in favor of his isolation and freedom, where no one could tell him what to do. With that resolve in mind, Haruka decided he would become the lone master of this world. But before that, he needs to hide to avoid being found by the bullies, so he throws himself into the bushes. One of them hears a sound and heads straight toward it, and all Haruka can do is hope the guy doesn't keep going. Luckily for him, a rabbit suddenly dashes out of the underbrush, startling the bully, and they all convince themselves it was just the animal, so they leave. Even though Haruka doesn't want to confront them, he stays close to overhear what they're talking about. Not that they're discussing anything particularly useful, as the apparent leader is reminding the others about the incredible figure of the vice class representative, while the rest of the dimwits start naming their own favorites. Since they're focused on talking about the class reps, Haruka recalls how those girls always manage to handle bullies like these. The leader then pesters Tanaka, a student outside their group, asking if the girls' skills will actually work for whatever they're planning, which makes Haruka think they're using the kid like a Google search. Finally, the leader jokes that the vice rep is waiting for him, and soon after, they all leave for good. With that, Haruka figures the entire class must be upstream, but either way, he knows all too well that solitude is the way to go. The biggest issue is that he hasn't managed to gather anything other than mushrooms, but at least he levels up his loner skill, possibly because he's avoided any interaction with his classmates. Still, he's only at level 3, probably because he hasn't leveled up the Master of None and Ventriloquist skills, which he doesn't even know what they mean. Without wasting time, he tries to make sense of these abilities. Master of None likely means he can't focus on just one thing enough to master it, but at least he can do pretty much everything in a mediocre way. As for Ventriloquist, it seems like a terrible skill, as if it implies he's a puppet in the hands of others. Regardless, he gives up on it for now and decides to eat to clear his head, even if it's just more mushrooms as usual. On the 7th day in the early hours, Haruka is awakened by the sound of metal clashing and some male battle cries, so he assumes it's the delinquents causing trouble again. However, as he approaches the noise, he sees the nerds fighting off a group of goblins, and he can't help but find it amusing, though he wonders if he should help since they don't seem to have the upper hand. Using his evaluation skill, the protagonist checks if these guys need help but realizes they don't. They're all at level 16, and from top to bottom, the first is a sorcerer, then a saint, a guardian, and a shinobi. Clearly, they didn't get stuck with useless skills like him, which is why they're doing so well. This reminds Haruka of his class, which had plenty of athletes and promising students, the cream of the crop. Thinking about it, he still doesn't understand how he ended up with them. As for the otaku nerds, they must have watched enough isekai to know how to handle a situation like this. So Haruka turns to leave, but his perception skill picks up on 2 goblins sneaking up on the nerds from behind. Instantly, the lone protagonist remembers how those guys were always nice to him. So Haruka steps in and takes out the 2 enemies. Afterward, he greets the group. Soon, they're all walking together, and the guys thank the loner for his help, but Haruka has been out of touch with friendship for so long that he's forgotten how to act in social situations, leaving him unsure how to respond to their gratitude. He leads the group to his cave, and they're all impressed by the place's architecture and decor, especially considering he built it all on his own. Striking up a conversation, Haruka asks what happened to the rest of the class and what they were doing in the forest at that hour. The nerds have trouble answering, so the sorcerer explains that they were running away. Starting from the beginning, everything began when they were all teleported into the forest. Some scratched their heads, others pinched themselves thinking it was a dream, while some cried like babies. However, the nerds were the most comfortable in this isekai world, which led the bullies to demand they explain everything about such worlds, or else heads would roll. Amidst the widespread panic, the class rep called for calm, but as soon as a horde of goblins appeared, no one could handle the situation. Not even the cocky delinquents could withstand the hostile creatures and retreated in the face of danger. The exception, once again, was the nerds. The guardian with his shield, the shinobi with his katana, the saint with his hammer, and the sorcerer with his spells. All of them charged at the goblins. Even the bullies and athletes joined the fight in the end, and the threat was eliminated. After their victory, the class rep suggested they find a safe place to stay, leading the group to the riverbank. Once there, the nerds used their isekai knowledge to develop survival strategies and set up a camp. The class reps divided the duties, assigning tasks like keeping watch, cooking, and gathering supplies. Thanks to this, the entire class managed to work together, or so it seemed. One day, however, the popular girls complained about having to gather firewood and refused to cooperate. Soon, others joined in, and before long, the leader had lost almost all the group members. Only the class reps, the nerds, and a few others remained at the camp, though some were still unmotivated and bored with the routine, so they slacked off. Then, a goblin attack hit the base, and the nerds, already overwhelmed with work, had to face the enemies alone. They'd won, but the price was exhaustion. Even so, the nerd sorcerer understood the challenge they faced. If they wanted to survive, they had to stick together and level up. After all, the goblins weren't the only threat. The bullies were too, because the sorcerer had seen them forcing another student to pass skills to them, like charm, which probably grants control over people, and puppeteer, which also suggests control over supposed puppets. In other words, the nerds weren't just leveling up to face external enemies, but the ones inside the camp as well. To keep an eye on the troublemakers, the Avtakas followed them deep into the forest and overheard a plan to establish a harem at the camp. They quickly rushed back to warn the class representative, who decided to level up as well, preparing to face the bullies head-on. However, the bullies had recently learned how to use charm and puppeteer abilities, making the challenge far from simple. Regardless, with great courage, the class rep confronted the rivals like a lamb to the slaughter. But contrary to expectations, all the bullies were swiftly taken down, left unable to move. Without wasting time, the nerds used magic to seal away the delinquents' sinister abilities, and with their harem plans exposed, the bullies were forced to flee from the camp. However, it was clear they wouldn't let this slide easily, and they soon returned for revenge. Things quickly spiraled out of control, with tents ablaze and panic spreading throughout the area. As if that wasn't enough, the attackers vowed to come back. In the end, the camp was reduced to ashes, and the popular girls blamed the nerds for the disaster, accusing them of starting a fight with the bullies. The rest of the students jumped on the bandwagon and also blamed the Avtakas. The class representative, along with a few others who didn't think the nerds were at fault, tried to defend them, but it wasn't enough. Consequently, the nerds were expelled from the camp as well. Upon hearing this story, Haruka was nearly moved to tears and hugged his comrades for the ordeal they had gone through. He even offered them a mushroom party to gossip and fill their stomachs. In the end, Haruka spent the night with his friends, realizing that having company isn't always a bad thing. As dawn broke, he bid farewell to his classmates, and Oda asked if Haruka would join them as they were planning to follow the river in search of a city to become adventurers. The loner admitted that there was no one else in this isekai with whom he'd want to team up, but in his usual mysterious way, he declined the offer and told the boys to leave. Watching the nerds walk away, Haruka reflected that his weak skills would only slow them down. Setting that aside, he decided to track down the class reps to get to the bottom of the situation. During his search, he encountered a kobold, got bitten, but managed to defeat the creature by hitting it on the head. As he continued his trek, he reached his class's destroyed campsite at nightfall. His enemy detection ability revealed human footprints crossing the river, so he followed the tracks and spotted the popular girls in the distance. He figured it would have been better to stay home and feast on roasted mushrooms. That was exactly what he was about to do when suddenly the most popular girls in the class confronted him. Haruka ran off, but when he heard one of them say, "Please stop," he decided to see if that was really what she had said. The popular girl quickly explained that they were looking for the nerds to apologize, as they had just realized the gravity of their mistake. After all, they were only alive because of them. Haruka found it strange that these pampered girls would want to apologize to anyone, since that would never happen in the original world. But he informed them that catching up to the nerds at this point was impossible. Still, one of the girls asked him to share what he knew, so Haruka responded with some tough questions of his own. Could they get out of the forest? Could they face monsters? Were they really going to find their saviors and apologize, or would they give up? Faced with his harsh words, the girls started crying like children, afraid they'd die in the endless forest. They begged Haruka to teach them everything he knew so they could survive and make amends for the mistake of banishing the nerds from the camp. After all this, Haruka noticed that his subjugation ability had been activated in the system, with the three girls listed as subjugated: the popular leader, popular girl A, and popular girl B. In other words, whether he liked it or not, he was now tied to them on this journey by the force of fate. And so, as the sun began to rise after hours of walking, the three girls followed him like baby ducklings trailing their mother. Haruka was losing his mind over their clueless behavior, especially the vacant look in their eyes. Fearing the moment when things would escalate, when they'd start slaughtering kobolds without hesitation and delivering their crystals like dogs returning a toy to their owner. At least that's how he imagined the subjugation ability worked. In the midst of these desperate thoughts, Haruka noticed one of the girls was injured, so he offered her a healing potion. But instead of using it properly, she poured the entire potion over Haruka, thinking that was the command. At that moment, he realized that if the class rep found out what had become of these girls, she'd definitely lose it, and there was no way he could face her with her class leader powers. Just as Haruka was contemplating how to undo the subjugation spell, the class representative appeared behind him, shouting to get his attention. Meanwhile, the bullies were plotting to go after the girls who were still lingering around the old campsite. But first, they had other problems to deal with. Returning to the protagonist, he tries to call the class representative by her name, but he simply can't remember it. This, of course, deeply irritates the girl, who makes sure to express her annoyance loudly and clearly. Shortly after, the other class reps catch up, clearly out of breath. The leader asks what happened to the preppy girls, as they don't seem to be in great shape, but truthfully, even Haruka would love an explanation. It looks like his subjugation skill has left the girls looking like zombies. Realizing what's going on, the class rep asks if Haruka used the subjugation skill on the preppy girls, and he nods somewhat reluctantly. She gets upset because that type of ability is only meant to be used on monsters, forcing Haruka to explain that it sort of happened by accident. After hearing that, all the girls give him a suspicious look, doubting his accidental explanation, and for a moment, Haruka almost turns into a block of ice under their cold, calculating stares. With some effort, he manages to wriggle out of the situation and tries to leave, but the girls insist that he stop right there. Frustrated, Haruka can't believe that this is the solitary life he was promised in this new world. The leader of the reps shakes Shimazaki, the head of the preppy girls, trying to see if she's okay. After some persistence, Shimazaki's eyes return to normal, and the class rep calls Haruka back to gather all the girls and discuss what's going on. At least now, Haruka is left alone, just as he wanted from the start. So he thinks about practicing his house expansion skill while he waits. Maybe he could even build a base or something like that. With this goal in mind, he gathers mana into his hands to activate the skill. But instead of doing what he expected, the boy is tragically buried in the ground, leaving only his neck above the surface. Naturally, the class rep has to dig him out so he can explain everything Shimazaki had told her. According to Shimazaki, Haruka had come to help them all, which makes the girls bow down to thank this merciful man for his assistance. That said, Haruka asks to go home, only to be scolded by the girls, who demand the help he had promised. The class rep wonders what he meant by going home, so Haruka explains that he has a house, one he built with his own hands after being thrown into this world. The girls are thrilled by this revelation, and the leader quickly calls for a new strategy meeting, leaving Haruka on the sidelines once again. The class rep asks how many people can fit in his house, to which Haruka responds that if you squeeze 6 people into a space the size of a tatami mat, you could fit about 240, even more if you move the furniture around and people don't mind crowding into the bathroom and kitchen. Hearing this, the girls are fascinated that his house even has such rooms, while the leader is shocked that he's living in a mansion in the middle of nowhere just like that. Regardless, the girls encourage their leader to make the requests, so she does, politely asking if she and her friends could stay at Haruka's house, at least for the night. As soon as she finishes her sentence, Haruka can barely believe that this huge group of high school girls is about to stay at his place, and the thought messes with his head in a way that makes it impossible to refuse. Without delay, he leads them all to his home, using his location skill to guide him through the dark night. Finally, after a long walk, the girls are huffing from exhaustion, unable to keep up with the brisk pace set by their host. He warmly welcomes them to his humble abode. Once they catch their breath and realize where they are, it becomes clear. They've arrived at a mansion in the middle of nowhere. This discovery excites the group of girls more than anything else they've experienced in this hostile new world. Somehow, Haruka finds it strange that the girls like his house even more than the nerds did, but now it's time to show them where everything is. As he points out the bathroom, most of the girls rush ahead to take a bath, throwing their clothes in the air as they go, leaving Haruka staring at a scene of dozens of girls bathing together. He realizes that all this time the forest has turned these girls into wild creatures. And since the place is now full of people, Haruka finds his own corner by setting up a tent outside. However, just as he's celebrating his solitude, he's interrupted by the leader of the class reps, who wants to thank him for all the support he's given. After the boys left, the girls were incredibly anxious, but now they're much calmer. It's amazing what a fancy room, some good food, and a warm bath can do for the human soul. Despite this, the leader admits that she doesn't feel like she's led her group well through all the terror they've endured. Haruka reassures her, saying that she's protected them tonight, but she replies that unfortunately, she can't do what Oda and the others can. To that, Haruka tells her that she doesn't need to. The nerds were practically made for this kind of environment, and they came here knowing exactly how to act. They're the aliens in this world for that reason. The rest of them have no idea how to survive here, so she shouldn't compare herself to them. This makes her feel a bit better, but she's still curious about one thing. If Haruka can build a mansion in the middle of nowhere, maybe he's the real alien in this story. Haruka is taken aback by her sharp perception. She bids him goodnight and heads off. After a long while, the girls finally get a chance to take a good bath and sleep in a proper bed, resting like babies in this unexpected mansion. Haruka, on the other hand, gets the least comfortable spot, but just being quiet in his own corner is enough. Along with his thoughts about shirt-clad girls, the perverted boy imagines this is going to be a long night. When dawn breaks again, a girl apologizes for waking Haruka up but informs him that breakfast is ready. He wakes up startled, having no idea who this person inside his tent is, and asks if he can sleep for just half an hour more before getting up. The girl crawls closer and teases that it looks like he has no intention of getting up at all. Feeling a bit awkward, Haruka tries to change the mood by asking what's on the menu for breakfast. She tells him there are mushrooms and grilled fish, which gets him excited, considering he spent all these days eating nothing but mushrooms. Without meaning to, he accidentally headbutts the girl. As they step out of the tent, the girl tries to recover from the hit, while Haruka, not one to miss an opportunity, skips the apologies and goes straight for the fish. With the first bite, his newfound love for the fish became stronger than anything else. The girl, representing her group, asks if Haruka hasn't been living near a stream, to which he replies that he has, but he's only been eating mushrooms and watching the fish swim by because they're too fast and clever to catch easily. Curious, he asks if the girls have an easier way to catch the fish, and they proceed to show him their technique, which makes the job much simpler. At the riverbank, one of the girls uses an electric power that instantly kills the fish. Fascinated, Haruka asks her to do it again. When she gathers electricity in her hands, Haruka uses his packaging skill to capture the spell and then uses it on the river with his own hands. Delighted, he celebrates having caught fish for the first time, and on top of that, he's developed his own electric magic. Apparently, with his packaging ability, he can capture any elemental magic and reproduce it in his own way. The girl comments that this seems a bit overpowered, to which Haruka adds that it appears to be a combination of the packaging skill and his Master of None ability. Still, he recalls that he was left with the worst powers while everyone else got the best ones, and controlling that electric magic almost made him wet his pants with excitement. Later, Haruka meets with the leader of the girls and asks if she's decided what to do next. She explains that they haven't reached a consensus yet, but it seems like everyone is heading to the city. Haruka imagines the girls are trying to catch up with the nerds, and they confirm that they need to apologize. The leader emphasizes that it would be important to gain a few levels before embarking on this journey, which Haruka agrees with. Since that's the plan, he'd like to help. The leader thanks him but clarifies that their goal isn't to chase after Oda and the other nerds. Haruka expresses disappointment, as he would have loved to see a showdown between the girls and the nerds with their strong abilities. Regardless, he gathers with all of them to begin their training journey. First, he asks what level each of them is at, and the ones at the front show they're between levels 16 and 21. Haruka is shocked that the lowest level shown is so high, considering he's only at level 7. But keeping his word, he quickly spots 3 kobolds lazing about in a nearby bush and asks the girls to take care of them since those monsters are only half their level. The girls start stretching and preparing for battle, but when the time comes, they are completely defeated. Haruka complains that it was pathetic, and the girls grumble that no one warned them the creatures would bite. A little later, instead of enjoying the peace and quiet in the tent he set up, poor Haruka watches as several girls gather inside for a review of the fight instead of being anywhere else. Before long, they leave the tent with their confidence restored, except for the purple-haired girl who woke Haruka earlier. She stays behind to apologize, explaining that she was just testing him earlier. When the boys attacked, she was almost caught and was left traumatized. That's why she wanted to see if Haruka would harm them, but he proved just the opposite. She adds that she'll wake him up again tomorrow for breakfast. And so the next morning, Haruka starts his day with fish while the girls train for their rematch with the kobolds. After training, some of them are too exhausted to even stand, while others pretend to be sick to avoid combat. Nevertheless, those who push through manage to defeat the trio of kobolds. After their victory, they greet the fallen creatures and begin to think of them as pet dogs. The group leader then informs Haruka that they're ready to head to the city with him, but he never said he was going along. Later, when everything is set, the girls finally depart. Haruka warns the leader that they have no way of knowing what lies ahead, so they need to stay sharp and keep their wits about them. That night, in the pouring rain, a student runs frantically, trying to escape someone chasing him. After stumbling over a rock, he falls hard to the ground and is soon caught. He screams that he doesn't have the ability the man is looking for, but the pursuer ignores him and attacks. The next day, Haruka leads the group through the forest, always mindful that the bullies could be lurking anywhere, watching them. That's why the leader needs to ensure everyone's safety, and for that to happen, the best course of action is to get out of there as soon as possible and reach the city. However, it wasn't just the delinquents that could pose a problem during this journey, because the forest itself held dangers that weren't easy to overcome. For instance, a massive orc suddenly blocks the group's path. Haruka immediately tells everyone to back off and watch closely as he takes on the monster alone, demonstrating the moves they should learn. As the human charges toward it, the orc swings its club at him but misses its target. Haruka uses that dodge to gauge the orc's speed. According to what the nerds had said, this race had great resistance to physical attacks, and the only way they had ever defeated such a creature was through magic. With that in mind, the lone hero opens his menu, searching for a spell that might be effective. Among them, he finds 4 elements, the classic elements of fire, water, earth, and air. Haruka had learned this ability after using packing in so many ways, like cleaning the floors in his own house, for example. In the end, even seemingly useless techniques could come in handy, and Haruka was becoming a master at turning them to his advantage. In any case, Haruka wasn't completely alone in this fight, so the orc resumes its attack, smashing a tree where Haruka had taken cover with its enormous club. The next few swings come dangerously close to the human, and before he ends up as mincemeat, Haruka quickly circles around the orc and whacks it with a stick, causing the poor creature to cry out and collapse to the ground. With this victory, Haruka becomes thoughtful, having just said that orcs are resistant to physical attacks, yet he just defeated one with a mere stick. Even the girls come closer to try to make sense of what just happened, especially since they hadn't learned anything from that bizarre performance. But since even Haruka couldn't explain what was going on, he promises to fight properly next time and rely on magic. Speaking of next time, the group soon encounters another orc further along the path. This time, Haruka decides to test his fire magic against it. He hurls a fireball at the creature and wins the battle, leaving everyone confused once again at how easily he's handling these fights. Besides, just like before, the girls weren't able to learn anything from the combat because this guy was just too overpowered to solve things like normal people. However, by nightfall, the girls weren't as angry as they had been earlier, since each of them now had a portion of roasted meat ready to be devoured as they relaxed at an improvised campsite for the night. A little way off, Haruka sets up his trap using earth magic to keep enemies at bay, in this case, an extremely deep pit. His magical tents not only have a monster repellent feature but can also detect presences, so the girls would be completely safe. With that taken care of, it was time to plot the next day's route using a map he had learned to summon with his evaluation skill. While observing the river's location, he's suddenly alerted to the presence of enemies in the area, so he rushes to check the situation. From a distance, he spots some male figures and assumes they're the bullies, making him break out in a cold sweat, but it turns out they're just the athletes, who approach Haruka in a friendly manner. Haruka wants to know what they're up to, assuming they're after something or someone in the woods. Offended, the athletes explain that they're not here for any girl, but for Haruka himself. As for the girls, they feel they can't trust anyone else in the class. Setting that aside, the athlete's leader informs him that there's a skill roaming the forest that's even more dangerous than marionette or hypnosis. Haruka wonders what kind of magic could be more troublesome than those two and recalls the skill called abduction. The athlete confirms that it's exactly that, and it's not the delinquents who have it, as one might expect, but someone from outside. At this, Haruka extends his hand threateningly and calls the boys idiots because they hadn't considered that he himself might possess that skill. However, if that's the case, the athletes agree it's 1,000 times better for it to be in his hands than the bullies, but they still want to know if the loner really knows how to cast that spell. Embarrassed, Haruka explains that, in fact, he can only use the magic of servitude, something the athletes have no clue about, but since it's in Haruka's hands, they trust that nothing too bad can happen, assuming the kid probably won't use it for anything very useful. Slightly offended by this statement, Haruka warns them not to mess with loners, but the athletes aren't looking for any trouble. In reality, they only came to warn the group to be careful with the abduction skill, and they'll keep an eye on the bullies lurking in the forest. Finally, they ask Haruka to apologize to the girls on their behalf for all the drama that went down at the class camp. With that, the boys bid farewell and leave while the class representative, who had been eavesdropping on the entire conversation, listened quietly. When morning arrives on the 17th, Haruka rallies the team to continue their trek, and for some unknown reason, the girls seem more cheerful than usual, leaving Haruka deep in thought. As he moves away from the group, the class representative approaches him to talk about the conversation he had with Kazikaze's group. Haruka explains that they apologize for everything that happened, but that's not what the girl wants to discuss. In fact, she's the one who apologizes to Haruka in advance, taking a long time to bring up the subject because it's such a heavy topic. Haruka quickly realizes that she's the one with the abduction skill, and this surprises her as she had asked Oda's group to keep that a secret. But now that Haruka knows, she wants to understand why he helped her even knowing this instead of being afraid. Haruka doesn't understand why she should be afraid, so she explains that this skill allows you to steal the target's ability after you take their life, making it the most overpowered and sinister technique of all. It's undoubtedly terrifying. Regarding this, Haruka points out that the nerds weren't scared either, and they seal off the puppet and hypnosis skills of the bullies but left the class rep with the kidnapping skill. This means they believe only she should carry that power. The class rep is moved to tears by this and says Haruka is to blame for her crying so much, leading him to run away while defending himself from the accusation. However, the truth is that she's grateful for everything he's done. Later, the group resumes their journey toward the river. Haruka, having reached the spot he wanted, takes the opportunity to test something he had in mind. Without a second thought, he dashes off in a certain direction and activates his magic infusion. He then uses the magic weight skill to lighten his magic, allowing him to take an enormous leap into the air, jumping from branch to branch until he reaches an incredible height. Obviously, he still hasn't learned how to fly, no matter how much he's tried, so he crashes to the ground, nearly losing all his HP. Without a doubt, he would have died if not for his magic infusion, but at least he figured out the path he needs to follow by playing bird for a few seconds. Later, still a bit out of it from the huge fall, Haruka tries to explain to the class rep how he returned to the escort all battered up but fails miserably. Regardless, at dawn, they set off again, this time using a much quicker route. Along the way, all sorts of things happen, like the girls from the class taking a group bath and a trio of orcs chasing everyone at one point. But no matter what, the team stays strong and united as they head toward their destination. And after the storm, the calm finally arrives. In other words, they find the exit to the forest and the girls cheer. On the other hand, Haruka remains cautious, unsure of what might be lurking in the hills. Checking his menu, he discovers that he learned the skill Airwalk thanks to his little performance from the previous day. Without delay, he tests the technique to see how it works, scanning the area to ensure it's safe before continuing the journey with the girls. As he looks around, he spots a group of locals in trouble. However, just because they're being attacked by monsters doesn't mean they're good people, so Haruka considers not helping them. On the other hand, the girls vote to rescue those people, and the class rep commits to fighting that group if they turn out to be bandits. Knowing she'd act that way, Haruka decides to go alone to avoid putting his companions at risk. To reach the group in danger, he repeats the magic he used the day before to run higher, but this time he adds a small tornado using the wind element to boost his speed. The problem is that the tornado ends up pulling the class rep along with him, and she desperately grabs onto his cloak to avoid becoming a pancake on the ground. But as if that weren't enough, the two realize they won't be able to stop their flight as planned, so they crash near the attacked group's carriage like a meteor. After the dust settles, the native men are left bewildered, though Haruka managed to take down the monsters surrounding them as well as apparently the class rep herself. Soon, the leader of the group, a man with black hair, introduces himself as Ofter, and another man says his name is Gaitek. Haruka wants to know why they were attacked, and Ofter explains that merchants were ambushed by a pack of great green wolves, so the guild put a bounty on the monsters' heads. The group thought they could make some money off it, but from what Haruka could see, they were totally wrong. Regardless, there's no use crying over spilled milk, so Ofter asks everyone to collect what's left of the spoils. Haruka roasts a mushroom for Gatek after the battle, and the local excitedly remarks that they're buff shrooms, mushrooms that provide buffs and are extremely valuable. Surprised by this, Haruka serves the rest of the group, and soon the girls start feeling as good as new. Watching this for some reason, Haruka begins to feel uneasy about these two men being in a group with such beautiful girls. Shortly after, the rest of the group catches up to Haruka, and the girls are delighted to meet an elf for the first time in their lives. Then they're guided by the locals to the much-anticipated city called Omu. To mark the unique moment, the group draws a line in the dirt to represent the finish line of a new life, and they leap over it, jumping toward the future. Meanwhile, the bullies continue leveling up in the forest, searching for the girls for the long-awaited showdown. A boy who had been captured by them advises the delinquents to break the seal placed on the puppet and hypnosis skills, but the problem is that to do so, they first need someone with the sealing skill. In other words, the bullies need to find the nerds who possess that technique before they can exact revenge on everyone. Strangely, as this conversation takes place, the boy accompanying the delinquents lets out a sinister laugh. At the same time, the athletes watch the enemies from afar, realizing that nothing good will come of this. Returning to the city of Onmui, the group members are enchanted by its beauty and liveliness. Finally realizing they are truly in another world, everyone is happy, except for Haruka, who doesn't feel this place is quite right for a loner like him. The girls are thrilled by the unique clothing stores and convenience shops filled with items they've never seen before. However, despite the initial excitement, the class representative reminds them there's something important they need to take care of. Seeing her rush off to fulfill her task, Haruka at least finds some comfort in knowing he brought everyone here safely, assuming his mission is now complete. Around the city, two girls remark that the buildings look like cupcakes and wonder if they could eat the houses. The representative has to be the voice of reason, reminding them that stones aren't exactly good for digestion. Struggling to keep up with the group's overwhelming enthusiasm, she asks Haruka for help, but he's already taking the opportunity to relax in the shade with a drink. Immediately, the class rep scolds him, acknowledging that he's just completed his mission, but insists that relaxing in an unfamiliar place is pushing it too far. In response, she blows a whistle, ordering all the girls to line up and salute. Once they do, she announces what needs to happen next. First of all, they need to head to the Adventurers Guild to sell off the junk they've collected so far and register as adventurers. After that, they'll need to find a place to stay for the night. The next day, they'll ask around about Oda's group. Upon hearing this, Shimazaki, the leader of the popular girls, asks why Oda's group is being pushed down the list of priorities. The rep, feeling cornered, explains that wasn't her intention. Haruka seizes the moment to tease that Shimazaki is really worried about the nerds, but she denies it, embarrassed to admit the truth. Either way, they finally head to the Adventurers Guild, and Haruka feels intimidated just by the exterior of the building. Inside, it gets even worse, as the place is filled with rough-looking characters who stare at the newcomers. After, one of the men in the guild approaches Haruka and informs him that the guild master wants to see him. Haruka quickly asks the rep to handle the registration while he deals with this problem. Nervous about all the eyes on him, Haruka heads toward Gatek, the guild's master. With a menacing appearance, Gatek asks if the boy in front of him is Haruka. Trembling, Haruka confirms. But to his surprise, the master stands up and politely thanks him for saving After's group, relieving Haruka, who had feared something much worse was about to happen. Feeling calmer now, Haruka wanders through the guild and finds the place where he can sell his magic stones. He heads to the counter, where a woman explains she'll assess the item's worth. Wasting no time, Haruka dumps dozens of stones on the counter, but the staff member warns him that it's impossible to calculate such a large amount at once, and he'll need to wait until tomorrow for all the items to be evaluated. At this point, the girls inform Haruka that they've all registered as adventurers. Both After and Gatek admit they underestimated the girls, never expecting them to be above level 30. Speaking of which, Shimazaki nudges Haruka to register as well, and for once is excited to finally belong to an official group in this new world. Seeing her friend's enthusiasm, the class rep comments to After and Gatek that Haruka is bound to become an excellent adventurer, since it was thanks to him that they all made it safely to the city. Haruka begins his registration but quickly learns he needs to be at least level 10. Since he's only level 9, he drops to his knees in despair, begging for an exception. But the staff member doesn't budge, further informing him that he also needs to be part of a group and can only proceed solo as an apprentice at level 20. Once he reaches level 30, he'll finally be recognized as a true adventurer. Devastated by this news, Haruka reflects that level 20 is still a long way off, and thanks to his loner skill, he can't officially join any group. Watching the scene unfold, the rep sees how shaken her friend is and takes responsibility for finding lodging for everyone that night. So by the evening, she leads the team to the hotel recommended by the guild. But Haruka isn't too pleased with the strange look of the place. As they enter, a young receptionist welcomes them with open arms, mentioning that the guild had informed her about the new arrivals. Noticing the hearts on each door, Haruka wonders if this is some sort of roadside love hotel, to which the rep tells him to pipe down. Later, he realizes there's nothing particularly odd about the rooms and even feels comfortable in the bed, though he admits to himself that he misses the forest. At the same time, Shimazaki wonders where Oda and the other boys are at this moment. When morning arrives on day 19 since the class arrived in this world, everyone is having breakfast when the rep announces that the city is relatively safe and has all kinds of shops. Seeing the girls' happiness, Haruka senses that they'll do well here while he plans to return to the forest once he sells his magic stones. Speaking of which, when he returns to the guild and sees the offer they made for his stones, the staff member tosses a bag of money onto the counter, apologizing that it's all they can offer for now. Haruka tells her to calm down as the guild master steps in to reinforce that they haven't even finished counting all the stones yet. As Haruka can see, they don't have enough money to pay for all of them at once, so they offer to pay him in installments. When Haruka accepts the offer, the master sets aside 8 million heals as the first payment, and Haruka reflects that if he's not mistaken, this money is worth almost the same as Japanese currency, which means he now holds just over $52,000. Next, the guild worker explains the market values in this world. In Haruka's case, he had enough F-rank magic stones to total 8 million heals, not to mention the bonus he earned from the Green Wolf mission they completed while saving After's group. With that money in hand, the class representative announces it's time to buy essential items. Gatek chimes in, saying he knows a great place where they can spend all that money, and Haruka starts thinking about the kind of place he loved to visit, undoubtedly filled with women. Foolishly, he heads to Gatek with that thought in mind, though he suspects it might be a bit early for such an event. Shortly after, they arrive at the place Gatek mentioned, a shop filled with items directly taken from dungeons. While the shop owner might seem a bit odd, he turns out to be a good guy. Right away, Haruka tests the invisibility cloak, the power gloves, the fire staff, and the mana-cutting sword. Completely smitten with everything, he comes across a necklace called 7 Shops, and the shopkeeper explains that this accessory allows you to fuse the effects of 7 other pieces of equipment into it. Even more obsessed with this item, Haruka is interrupted by the class rep, who orders him to return to the hotel immediately because it's time for bed. Frustrated, the lone wolf asks if he can at least test one more item, the mistletoe twig, which strengthens magical staffs and rods. However, as he grabs the object, he accidentally activates it and fuses all the equipment without even having paid for the magical necklace. The shop owner is furious and informs him that the item is worth over 10 million heals, so Gaytech and the class rep try to persuade the shopkeeper to sell it at a discount given the situation. By the 20th, Haruka was completely broke due to his mishap, even though there was still so much he wanted to buy. Fortunately, the shopkeeper reduced the price of the item to 8 million, but now the kid is flat broke again. And now, even if he wants to gather more magic stones to sell, outsiders can't leave the city without first becoming adventurers and obtaining a permit. And if he tries to sneak out with the girls, the class rep definitely won't allow it. Faced with this, Haruka concludes that city life isn't for him, and he needs to find a way back to the forest. At least now he has the invisibility cloak fused with his peasant set A, which will be incredibly useful. With it, Haruka sneaks past all the girls from his class and makes his way to the city wall. But just as he's about to leap over and escape, a few girls from the class call out to him, causing him to crash into the wall. Putting that aside for now, he and the girls witness one of their group members almost stripping in public to test out a new outfit, so Haruka rushes to stop her from causing a scene. In the end, his first escape plan was a failure. On the 21st, the girls prepare to go on their first mission. Haruka asks to join them, but the class rep shuts him down after his attempt to flee the previous day. Still, after their departure, the lone wolf sneaks past the gate guard with his invisibility cloak and makes it to the outside. Overjoyed, he sprints back to the forest, ignoring every obstacle in his way, including a group of bandits attacking a carriage with a defenseless girl inside. However, the bandits attack him, not wanting to leave any witnesses, forcing Haruka to fight. So he summons his fire bullet to take care of the situation and return to the forest. With that, he takes down all the thugs and realizes that his wooden staff has evolved into a cane, becoming much stronger, all thanks to the mistletoe twig he activated in that shop, or maybe the fire staff he fused also had an effect. Soon after, the bandits rise again and discover their opponent is merely a level 9 boy, so they prepare to use weapon skills, techniques that only those at level 20 and above can wield. The first uses slash, the second uses double, and the third strikes with dash. Haruka notices that these are powerful skills, but the thugs have no idea how to use them properly, so they end up exhausting themselves and losing on their own. With this, the lone wolf realizes that while weapon skills are potent, these enemies were still weak and couldn't handle their own abilities. Then the girl from the carriage thanks the stranger who saved her. She introduces herself as Marielle, a noble with such an odd personality that even Haruka can't quite understand her behavior. She explains that she's the daughter of a local lord and asks the young man to accompany her for the rest of her journey, as she doesn't feel safe after the attack. Of course, she's more than willing to show her gratitude for his help. Though Haruka was eager to return to the forest, that last part convinced him to stay and assist. Inside the carriage, Marielle asks which city Haruka came from. So he explains that he came from a horrible place with a lousy guild where they don't even let visitors leave whenever they want. Because of this and other reasons, the boy is certain the lord of that city is as awful as the place he governs. Upon hearing this, Marielle starts crying as she's the daughter of the lord of the city Haruka just insulted. Oh, and by the way, this carriage is headed back to Omu. Upon realizing this, Haruka panics and tries to get out, but the noble insists she needs to reward him for saving her. Meanwhile, the athletes and the bullies clash in the forest, but the leader of the athletes is pierced by an enemy's blade. In the wake of their first ally's fall, the group realized the situation was more serious than they had anticipated. However, the blade that pierced the boy did not belong to the bullies but to an independent figure who seemed to be on the battlefield autonomously. This swordsman swiftly dispatched the next bully, who attacked him by driving his sword into the opponent's torso and downing another. Yet the bullies persisted in their assault, driven by rage at seeing their companions fall so easily. As expected, the mysterious swordsman quickly cut down the remaining 2 bullies in the blink of an eye. Faced with this reality, the athletes desperately ran for their lives. In the end, the swordsman circled to the front of his adversaries, showing that no one could escape unless he allowed it. Turning back to Haruka, he was still desperate about returning to Omu, the last place he wanted to be right now. Marielle made a pitiful face and asked if he really needed to make such a drama about it. The young man replied that it wasn't fair to make puppy dog eyes to get what she wanted, because now he couldn't say no. Thus, he reached the lord of Omu's mansion, a house so large it made him nervous. Looking at a painting, he wondered if it depicted the lord and his wife. Although they seemed very happy together, all he wanted was to leave as soon as possible. But just as he sneaked towards the nearest door, Marielle appeared again to question what was happening, annoying that he didn't wait for her to change as she had asked. Haruka lied, saying he was just going to wait outside, but she had already guessed that he was trying to escape and made a point of throwing it in his face. As Haruka continued to pretend that was not the case, Mariel lost patience and asserted that she would see the warrior rewarded one way or another, so he should stay where he was. Later, to prove she wasn't lying, the noble dragged the guest to a real feast spread on the table, and he gave up the idea of leaving to indulge in the food. Afterwards, Mariel asked one of the maids to bring the cash reward for having been saved. Moreover, knowing the hero had no form of identity in these lands, she handed him an Onwi identity card, which would allow him to come and go from the city whenever he wanted. In return, of course, the noble only expected that the man would at least remember the name of this town from now on. However, Haruka was far from concerned about this. Rather, he was more focused on the consistency of the pudding he would eat. Embarrassed, Mariel commented softly that she had dressed up for him to act this way. On the 22nd, he had to return to the inn where his group was, so he explained that he hadn't tried to escape at all, but it happens that the city lord had invited him to his mansion. Suspicious, the girls wanted to know why the team member was invited there, so Haruka pretended he didn't know why. At that moment, some of the girls dropped the subject and went on a mission, leaving Haruka hopeful that the others would also forget the whole thing and leave. But before going, the class representative insisted that the young man could not leave the city. Cynical and carefree, Haruka affirmed once again that he understood. With that, the women left, leaving him alone again. Wasting no time, he flashed a mischievous smile and prepared for a new escape attempt with his invisibility cloak. But this time, he had the trump card that would ensure everything went right: his identity earned from the Lord's daughter. Thus, he dashed the gate of Onyu. But before he left, he thought it would be good to buy some items with the money he had won from Mariel, in addition to eating all kinds of food that were not mushrooms. Lastly, he felt he should leave a letter for the class representative, preferably something that wouldn't upset her further. In this case, he simply made it clear that he was going to check on the athletes in the forest, and while he was away, asked the girls to continue leveling up. With everything ready, he finally headed to the exit where a burly soldier guarded the passage. Without delay, Haruka showed his new identity and secured his freedom after having been unnecessarily confined in Onyu. This time, if there was any carriage being attacked along the way, he would pretend he didn't see it and keep moving. Sometime later, he arrived at his beloved forest where the old mushrooms grew in the underbrush and the fish swam in the river and the usual monsters lurked. Observing all these elements, Haruka felt at home once again. However, speaking of home, it was his cave that he could not wait to reach, so he resumed his run to his beloved residence. On the way, a huge orc attempted to attack the lone one but was easily defeated. Thinking about it, Haruka realized it was strange for such a creature to be in this part of the forest, as this race usually resides in the deeper parts of the forest. Nevertheless, he discovered that the items he had bought in Onui were indeed very useful in the woods because he took down that opponent without any difficulty. Despite his confidence in his equipment, as the sun began to set on the horizon, the lone one realized something was wrong with this place, especially when at a certain point on the path he found a bloodstain spread on a rock. He guessed it wasn't the blood of the nerds because they were anicaps professionals, so he assumed it was from the athletes. Soon he spotted footprints ahead and noticed a large trail of blood accompanying the path. Without delay, he ran in that direction and came upon the athletes severely injured on a rock. Seeing that they were alive, he threw several healing potions made from mushrooms in an attempt to save the group. Having done this, the leader of the athletes recovered enough to see that it was Haruka and asked if the girls were safe. Haruka replied that they were fine in the city, all thanks to the athletes. With that, Kazakazi was glad to think he had helped the class. Then the lone one completed that they were the best athletes the class could need. With the fall of night, the protagonist learns that all the delinquents are dead, and no one knows where the nerds have gone. As for who killed the bullies, it was an unknown individual who was simply unstoppable, and who also stole all the weapons they brought into this world. According to Kazakazi, that swordsman must be a genius, for he surely planned this entire scheme in advance. Moreover, the leader claims this stranger must be after the class representative because she possesses the abduction skill, which allows the user to steal an enemy's abilities upon killing them. In other words, it's the most overpowered and sought-after skill imaginable. Aside from that, Haruka is worried because in his mind only he and the nerds knew that girl had this ability. In reality, the athletes just assumed she had this power because the swordsman kept asking about the representative. Ultimately, he let the group live because he figured at some point the athletes would go after the representative, which would give him a chance to follow them to his target. However, the athletes decided to wander through the forest to avoid doing what the enemy wanted and ended up nearly dead there. Anyway, the mysterious foe will surely follow the blood trail to this location. But with Haruka's help, the team leader thinks they can win this fight by joining forces. Hearing this, Haruka reflects that he would hate to get involved in this dispute because his only desire is to live alone and in peace in this forest, but duty calls and he can't just ignore what's happening. With that in mind, he announces that he will help, but not with the athletes and instead alone. Thus, they should head to the city and join the girls. Soon after the men leave, Haruka knows it would be easier to have them at the rear, but if everyone dies to this mysterious swordsman, no one will be left to protect the women. Meanwhile, the girls look for the lone wanderer around Omiyu. But even though Haruka left a letter, the class representative can't help but worry. Back to the protagonist, he heard from the athletes about the swordsman's weapon skill. Although such a skill is powerful, once you initiate it, you cannot cancel it, and it leaves the user vulnerable. Haruka needs to find a way to exploit this weakness, but for that, he needs to level up to match his opponent. Thus, he defeats some goblins along the way, but it's not enough because he needs stronger opponents. Then he's lucky to encounter the Goblin King, which might be his chance to gain enough experience. However, he must first defeat this monster, which is definitely not weak. Being careful not to be crushed by that huge club, Haruka finds an opening to cast the magic envelope, which gathers several spells into one. With it, he strikes a mortal blow on the enemy and resolves the dispute. Next, to his surprise, the Goblin Emperor appears, a level 50 creature well above the level 9 of the Lone Wanderer. Haruka figures he cannot face such a monster head-on, but since he's not confident he can escape, he only has the option to use the same tactic as before, mixing all the terrible skills he has to form a single magic. Done this, he charges at the goblin and applies this technique, which seemed to have caused some damage, even though the monster gets up again and does not seem so affected. Soon, it retaliates from the suffered attack and slashes the face of the Lone Wanderer, who has to dodge to avoid the potentially fatal blow. Finding a minimal opening, Haruka takes advantage and counterattacks with his staff, and finally, the Goblin Emperor's HP is reduced to almost half. But the creature starts to heal immediately and launches a powerful skill that throws the boy back with force. After colliding with some trees and feeling that he is hanging by a thread, Haruka remembers that he cannot falter at this moment because his friends depend on the success of his mission. Keeping this in mind, he attacks the Goblin Emperor with the remaining strength he has. Hours later, when the sun rises again in the forest, Haruka is exhausted after taking down his enemy. Suddenly, he lets out a shout of relief to celebrate his ascent to level 11. Then he goes to his home in the cave to discover the skills he gained. The skill he invented, where various magics are mixed into one, now resolves the opening left by the use of a weapon skill, allowing him to attack without preparation as soon as he selects the skill. Later, a man approaches Haruka's dwelling, and as he gets closer to the Lone Wanderer, he lowers his hood and reveals himself to be Tanaka, the boy who supposedly suffered bullying from the bullies but actually had much more sophisticated plans than just suffering at the hands of those boys. Meanwhile, the girls return to Omiyu after another day of hunting, only to find the athletes at the city wall. In the meantime, Kakizaki explains that Haruka stayed behind to face an enemy personally. In the forest, the Lone Wanderer sarcastically welcomes Tanaka into his residence, while the opponent laments not yet having reached the class representative through those nearly dead athletes, especially after all the effort he made to infiltrate the group of bullies and control them all. With that said, Haruka realizes that Tanaka was behind all this the whole time, and he confesses that he used the delinquents to separate the entire class. Furious, Haruka asks about the other men of the group besides the athletes and bullies, then the boy responds remorselessly that they are all dead, but soon decides to stop the small talk because his priority is to reach the abduction skill as soon as possible and not waste time with a loser who ended up with all the worst skills like Haruka. Hearing these words, Haruka points his weapon at the opponent and prevents his departure, then Tanaka decides to kill the Lone Wanderer right there.